Has your pastor quoted the book of Jude recently? Well, did you know that Jude quotes the book of Enoch? But your pastor calls Enoch heresy. So, essentially, the Bible quotes a banned book as prophecy. Your church preaches the theology from that book, most likely every single week. But if you try to read it yourself, they'll tell you that it's not canonical, or it's even heretical. All aboard Arnie's Brain Train. I'm Alex Arnold, and today I'm going to show you something that's going to make a lot of modern creedal Christians a little uncomfortable. Every major doctrine that your church teaches about angels, demons, spiritual warfare, and the end times comes from books that were removed from the Bible. Now look, the New Testament directly quotes these texts. Early church fathers called them scripture, and Jesus himself operated within their theological framework. But somewhere between the 7th century BC and now, these books got excluded from the canon while their theology remained standard Christian teaching. So today we're going to walk through exactly how that happened and why. Really quick, you will see AI generated images in this video. I don't want to deal with copyright, and my small creator budget doesn't really include royalties. But honestly, AI also generates some really cool and sometimes pretty funny visuals for this kind of content that you just can't get from stock photos. Long story short, the images are AI, but the research is real, and it's all in the pinned comment and the description. If you want to fact check my claims, go for it. If you just want to complain about the graphics, there's the thumbs down button. Like I mentioned, all my sources are below. I know that some of you are going to disagree with what I'm about to show, and that's totally fine. Go read the sources and then form your own opinion. So, let's examine how modern Christian theology is built on texts that were later deemed as non-canonical. Facts over feelings, all aboard. Let's get into it. So let's start with the basics. What books are we actually talking about here? We're mostly talking about the books of Enoch, 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, and 3rd Enoch, but also the book of Jubilees, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Wisdom of Solomon, and the book of Tobit. Now, 1st Enoch was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. This is one of the most well-preserved ancient Jewish texts that we have. Multiple copies in Aramaic and Hebrew, and physical manuscripts that have been carbon dated between 300 and 100 BC. In fact, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has had 1st Enoch in their Bible for over 1,000 years at least. It's currently scripture to millions of Christians right now, today. The Slavonic tradition preserved 2nd Enoch, and Jewish mystical circles kept 3rd Enoch alive through Merkabah and Kabbalah literature. But for most of Western Christianity, these texts are apocryphal. Now here's what actually matters, and this is where it gets interesting. The New Testament directly quotes these books as authoritative. Look at Jude 14 and 15. It explicitly names Enoch as a prophet. And Enoch also, the 7th from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all. That's a word-for-word quote from 1st Enoch chapter 1 verse 9. Then you've got 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 referencing the watcher story from Enoch. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment. Jude chapter 6 does the same thing. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. What we see is that the New Testament authors are treating Enoch as historical fact, quoting it as prophecy, and building their entire theology on its framework. And the early church fathers did the same. Tertullian defended Enoch's canonicity around 200 AD. Irenaeus quoted it, Clement of Alexandria cited it as scripture, and the Epistle of Barnabas treats it as authoritative. So, if the New Testament quotes these books, and if early Christians read them as scripture, and if they were preserved by multiple Christian communities for centuries, why are they excluded from most modern Bibles? The question has two answers. First, there's a problem with how scholars date these texts, and second, there's the issue of why church institutions decided to exclude them. Let's start with the dating problem because that's going to set up everything else. When scholars date biblical and apocryphal texts, they use two methods. First, there's physical evidence, carbon dating of manuscripts, and second, there's textual analysis, basically trying to figure out when the content was likely written based on historical references, language, and theology. Now, the carbon dating is legitimate science. Physical manuscripts of 1st Enoch found at Qumran date to 200 to 150 BC. No dispute there, we have the physical evidence. But here's where it gets problematic. When scholars look at passages in 1st Enoch and see detailed descriptions of a divine Son of Man who will judge the world, and specific prophecies about a pre-existent Messiah who will redeem humanity, they often conclude, well, this must be written after Jesus, because how could they know about Christ before he existed? But that's circular reasoning, and frankly, it's hogwash. They're dating the text based on the assumption that prophetic literature about the Messiah couldn't exist before the Messiah showed up. But we know that Jesus quoted Enoch. Jude quotes Enoch by name and calls him a prophet. So, either the Messianic content was there before Jesus, or the New Testament authors are quoting a random scripture forgery as prophecy. Think about what Jesus said in Luke chapter 24. Beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. In verse 44 he says, all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me. Jesus is claiming that the prophets spoke of him, not vaguely, but specifically enough that he could explain how the scriptures pointed to him. But by the time Jesus showed up in 1st century Palestine, mainstream Judaism didn't recognize him, and the religious establishment completely rejected him. But why? Because of systematic editing of Jewish scripture over centuries, what scholars call the Deuteronomistic revisions. This was the editing process that stripped out Messianic language, divine council theology, and polytheistic elements that didn't fit post-exilic monotheism. We've seen this pattern before when looking at how ancient Israelites recognized multiple gods. Archaeological evidence shows one thing, but the edited scriptures present a sanitized version. Here's what's really significant. The people who did recognize Jesus weren't the mainstream religious authorities. They were groups on the margins. The Essenes at Qumran, who preserved 1st Enoch and had more copies of it than they had of Deuteronomy, and the Nazarenes who maintained older traditions, and the Samaritans who kept the versions of the Torah that Jerusalem had rejected, and the Ethiopian Jews who still read Enoch as scripture today. These communities preserve the Messianic teachings through texts like Enoch, and that's exactly the point. If 1st Enoch was written before Jesus and contains detailed Messianic prophecy that Jesus himself referenced, then we need to completely reassess how we date other ancient texts. Any text that gets dismissed as too Christian or dated later because it contains Messianic language needs to be reevaluated. The existence of 1st Enoch proves that detailed knowledge about the Messiah existed in Jewish communities before Jesus. That's not speculation. We have the actual physical manuscripts, we have the New Testament quotations, and we have the historical evidence of communities preserving these texts. When Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16 that all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, he wasn't talking about the New Testament because it didn't exist yet. He meant all of the Hebrew scriptures that Second Temple Jews were reading, which included texts like Enoch. We know that Jesus referenced these traditions. Matthew 27 quotes Wisdom of Solomon chapter 2. He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now, if he will have him, for he said, I am the Son of God. The rich man and Lazarus parable in Luke 16 pulls from Enochic tradition, and John chapter 1 verse 51 references apocryphal visions. Hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So now let's shift gears to look at the specific doctrines that come from these texts, starting with 1st Enoch. Let's start with the foundational story in 1st Enoch, how evil entered the world. You've probably heard this taught in church. Before humans, there were angels. Some of these angels rebelled against God, led by Lucifer, and they fell from heaven. These fallen angels became demons who now tempt humanity. So, here's a question. Where is that story actually found in the Bible? Genesis 6 gives you exactly 4 verses about sons of God coming to earth and having children with human women, creating the Nephilim. That's it. No names, no motivations, no cosmic rebellion, and no explanation of what happened to these beings or their offspring. But 1st Enoch, specifically chapters 6 through 16, the section called the Book of the Watchers, gives you the complete story. 200 angels, led by figures named Semjaza and Azazel, descend to Mount Hermon. They make a pact with each other, they take human wives, and then they start teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity. Now, please forgive my pronunciations of these names ahead of time. Azazel taught weapons of war. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armoros taught counter-enchantments. Barakijel taught astrology. Kokabel taught constellations. Ezekiel taught cloud knowledge. Arachiel taught earth signs. Shamsiel taught sun signs, and Sariel taught moon phases. Their offspring, the Nephilim, became violent giants consuming everything, teaching violence, and driving humanity towards destruction. This is why God sent the flood, not just because people were wicked, but because the divine order had been overthrown by rebellious angels and their hybrid offspring. God imprisoned these watchers in chains of darkness in Tartarus until final judgment. Every Sunday school lesson about Satan's rebellion is also pulling from this Enochic narrative, definitely not from what's actually written in Genesis. And we know that the New Testament authors were familiar with this story because they reference it directly. Peter writes, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into the chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." Jude chapter 6 says essentially the same thing. "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." They're not making vague allusions. They're directly referencing the Watcher's narrative from 1st Enoch. And then Jude goes even further. He explicitly calls Enoch a prophet and quotes him by name in Jude chapters 14 and 15. So, the Bible quotes Enoch as a prophet. It references his stories as historical fact, and it builds doctrines on his cosmology. But most churches today call his book non-canonical. Why? The New Testament authors also build their entire understanding of their spiritual realm on Enochic cosmology. When Jesus talks about Satan falling like lightning from heaven in Luke chapter 10, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven," he's operating within this framework that his audience would have immediately recognized because they were familiar with Enochic literature. The early church fathers understood this connection as well. Tertullian explicitly defended Enoch's canonicity in 200 AD. Irenaeus quoted it in his writings, and Clement of Alexandria cited it as scripture. They weren't treating it as an interesting side text. They were treating it as authoritative revelation. Today, modern pastors continue to preach these doctrines. They just don't tell you where the doctrines actually come from. Now let's look at another doctrine that comes from 1st Enoch, the idea of territorial spirits and spiritual warfare. You've probably heard teachings about territorial spirits and principalities and powers, the concept that demons rule over specific nations and geographic regions, or maybe teachings about spiritual warfare where Christians bind demons over cities and claim territory for God. This all gets presented as biblical doctrine, usually referenced to Ephesians chapter 6. But the actual framework for understanding these spiritual hierarchies comes from 1st Enoch and the divine council theology in the original Hebrew texts. Let me show you what I mean. Deuteronomy chapter 32 in most English Bibles says, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel." But that's not what the original Hebrew manuscripts say. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, which was the Bible that Jesus and the early church used, say something different. According to the number of the sons of God, or according to the number of the angels of God. That changes the entire meaning. Instead of God just organizing nations based on how many Israelites there would eventually be, this is describing God assigning divine beings, angels, to rule over different nations. Each nation got its own divine overseer. Israel got Yahweh himself, but the other nations got members of the heavenly council. This is what scholars call divine council theology, the idea that God has a heavenly court of divine beings who are assigned authority over the nations. And when some of these divine beings rebelled against God's authority, they became corrupted. They became the demons and territorial spirits that Paul references as principalities and powers. You can see the same theology in Psalm 82 verse 1. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. These aren't metaphorical gods. These are actual divine beings who have been given authority and are now using it. And where exactly does this whole framework come from? 1 Enoch. Chapters 6 through 8 describe how these divine beings, the Watchers, were originally assigned to watch over humanity, but they rebelled. They abandoned their posts, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and corrupted the earth. 2nd Enoch and 3rd Enoch expand on this with multiple levels of heaven and detailed angelic hierarchies. But 1st Enoch is where the foundation gets laid. This idea that there are divine beings with delegated authority who can either serve God faithfully or rebel against him. Now, some people hear this and immediately object. Wait, doesn't this contradict monotheism? Isn't this polytheism? Not really. What you're seeing here is what scholars call henotheism, the recognition that while other divine beings exist and have real power, only Yahweh is supreme and worthy of worship. That was actually the original theological framework of ancient Israel before it got edited into strict monotheism during and after the Babylonian exile. So, when you hear modern teaching about spiritual warfare, about strategic level spiritual warfare, demons ruling over territories, spiritual mapping to identify which demons control which cities, all of that theological framework traces back to texts that most churches consider non-canonical. See Peter Wagner's theology that influenced millions of charismatics and Pentecostals? That's Enochian. Cosmology with contemporary language. Frank Peretti's best-selling novel, This Present Darkness, that taught an entire generation of evangelicals about territorial spirits fighting over towns. But it's the divine council theology straight from 1st Enoch. Churches teach this material in seminars. They write best-selling books about it. And they preach sermon series on spiritual warfare. But mention that it comes from 1st Enoch, and you'll get pushback, and possibly called a heretic. What does Christianity teach about angels and demons? Do me a favor and close your eyes. Now picture an angel. You probably see wings, glowing light, maybe a halo, and possibly a flaming sword. Now picture a demon. Dark, twisted, maybe horns, maybe even bat wings. But that detailed imagery isn't in the canonical Bible. It is in the banned books. The Protestant Bible mentions exactly 2 angels by name, Michael and Gabriel. But Christians have an entire angelology system. 7 archangels, cherubim, seraphim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, a whole 9-tier hierarchy. 1st Enoch provides detailed angelic descriptions, functions, and hierarchy. It names specific angels and their roles. Uriel over the world in Tartarus, Raphael over the spirits of men, Raguel brings vengeance on the luminaries, Michael over the best part of humankind, Sariel over the spirits who sin, and Gabriel over all powers. This is an organizational chart. 2nd Enoch describes 10 orders of angels with specific duties. Pseudo-Dionysius adopted this in the 5th century as standard Christian angelology. Catholics and Orthodox pray to these angels, especially Raphael from the Book of Tobit. Protestants reject Tobit as apocryphal, but still name children Raphael and teach specialized angelic roles. The New Testament assumes this knowledge. Paul mentions principalities and powers in Ephesians 6 without explanation because his audience understood the Enochic framework. Colossians chapter 1 verse 16 mentions thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. So, where did the 1st century Jews get this detailed spiritual hierarchy? From Enoch, from all of the now banned books that were widely read in Second Temple Judaism. In demons, the idea that they're disembodied spirits roaming the earth, 1st Enoch chapter 15. not in Genesis, not in Job, in a banned book. Enoch says, when the Nephilim, giant offspring of watchers and human women, were killed in the flood, their spirits didn't die. As half-angelic, half-human hybrids, they became the demons plaguing humanity, not fallen angels themselves, but restless spirits of giants. That's why demons in the Gospels constantly seek to possess human bodies. They're seeking physical form lost in the flood. That's why Jesus has authority to cast them out. He's dealing with beings that shouldn't exist, corruptions of God's created order. Pastors preach spiritual warfare regularly. Guardian angels, territorial spirits, demonic hierarchies, principalities over nations, and binding and loosing authority. But this framework comes from Enochic cosmology. It's presented as if it's from Ephesians or Revelation, when Paul and John operated within an Enochic worldview, assuming readers had encountered these texts. Finally, let's examine how the Messiah was prophesied and who Jesus claimed to be. Did Jesus exist before creation? Every Christian says yes. What about biblical support? John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, or even Hebrews chapter 1. But all of those verses and teachings echo theology already established in Second Temple Judaism through Wisdom of Solomon and First Enoch. Wisdom of Solomon, written around 100 BC, describes divine wisdom as a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty, a reflection of eternal light, an image of His goodness. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 describes Christ almost identically, who being the brightness of His glory and the express image of His person, and upholding all things by the word of His power. Hebrews is borrowing wisdom theology and applying it to Jesus. This isn't original Christian doctrine. It's Hellenistic Jewish theology from a non-Protestant canon book. First Enoch chapter 48 verses 2 through 6 describe the Son of Man as pre-existent. Before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of heaven were made, His name was named before the Lord of spirits. He shall be a staff to the righteous, and He shall be the light of the Gentiles. This is Messianic theology from 200 BC. But remember, their dating assumes that Jews couldn't have detailed Messianic knowledge before Jesus. So, what's up with that? First Enoch introduces the Son of Man as a pre-existent heavenly Messianic figure who will judge the world and reign forever. That's the title that Jesus constantly uses for Himself. Enoch describes final judgment in detail: resurrection of the dead, opening of books, separation of righteous and wicked, and eternal punishment of watchers, and creation's renewal. This echoes in Matthew chapter 25, Revelation chapter 20, and 2 Peter chapter 3. The Messiah sitting on a throne with surrounding angels, that's from Enoch. Paradise and punishment details, Enoch provides 7 heavens, multiple soul compartments, and specific locations for angelic imprisonment. The entire apocalyptic framework that Jesus and the apostles operated within was shaped by Enochic tradition. They inherited it, and they assumed that the audiences knew it as well. Jesus uses language from the similitudes of Enoch. He talks about the Son of Man coming on clouds, sitting on a throne of glory, with nations gathered for judgment. He's identifying Himself with the Messianic figure from Enochic prophecy. His audience understood immediately. When Jesus tells the Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14, "Hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven," the high priest tears his robes and accuses Him of blasphemy. Why? Because Jesus just claimed to be the figure from Daniel chapter 7, elaborated in Enochic literature, the pre-existent divine Son of Man sharing God's throne. The high priest understood exactly what Jesus claimed. Modern pastors understand too, but this understanding requires reading texts later removed from most canons. Early Christians inherited these ideas from Jewish apocalyptic literature, but later church leaders deemed that same literature as non-canonical. So if these books are this foundational, and if the New Testament quotes them, and if early Christians viewed them as so authoritative, why were they excluded? Short answer: church politics, and institutional control. First Enoch was widely accepted in early Christianity. Tertullian, Irenaeus, and Clement quoted it as scripture. The Epistle of Barnabas treats it as authoritative, and it was in early Christian canon. But by the 4th century, as the church consolidated power and standardized doctrine, Enoch became problematic. So why? Basically, it was too Jewish, too mystical, and too detailed about things that the church wanted mysterious. Books giving direct theological access without priestly mediators would threaten institutional power. Jerome, translating the Latin Vulgate, explicitly rejected Enoch. Augustine was skeptical, and the Council of Laodicea established a canon excluding it. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian church kept it. When European scholars rediscovered Enoch in the 1700s from Ethiopia, Western churches had to explain why millions of Christians had been reading heresy as scripture for centuries. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, they contained multiple Enoch copies. Carbon dating confirmed it, and textual analysis confirmed it. Genuine Second Temple Jewish text predating Christianity. Scholars were forced to admit that Enoch was older than thought, more influential than acknowledged, and more authoritative in early Judaism and Christianity than church tradition allowed. But changing the canon, admitting error, that would undermine authority structures completely. When early church fathers established canon at councils of Hippo and Carthage, they had criteria: apostolic authorship or connection, widespread church use, theological consistency with emerging orthodoxy, and no contradictions with accepted texts. The problem was that books like Enoch were widely used in the Bible and by church fathers, but they contained politically inconvenient ideas. First Enoch taught angels could sin sexually, which complicated angelic nature debates. Second Enoch described multi-tiered heaven, which was not fitting in neat boxes. Jubilees had different chronologies, conflicting with rabbinic authority. Wisdom of Solomon was too Hellenistic and too philosophical. But they kept the useful theology and removed the source text, giving people direct access to that theology without institutional mediation. The theology was too embedded to remove. Christians had taught it for 300 years, but the books threatened control. So the solution? Declare them apocryphal, claim that they're useful but not canonical, and gradually remove them from awareness. Except that they forgot to remove the theology. Oops. So, pastors continue preaching Enochic theology while treating Enoch itself as non-canonical. And they continue to use the theological framework without acknowledging textual sources. As always, let's bring this all together and see what we've actually covered here. Modern pastors are preaching that fallen angels rebelled and corrupted humanity, but that entire doctrine comes from First Enoch, not Genesis. They're preaching complex angelology with archangels, hierarchies, and spiritual warfare. That theology comes from Enoch and other Second Temple texts, not really the canonical Bible. They're teaching about a divine council, sons of God governing nations, and cosmic spiritual authority. That whole framework comes from Enoch and the original form of Deuteronomy 32. They're preaching about the pre-existence of Christ, divine wisdom, Christology, the Son of Man sitting on a throne. All of that was developed in Wisdom of Solomon and Enoch, then applied to Jesus. And they're preaching apocalyptic scenarios with detailed judgments, resurrections, and messianic thrones, all built on Enochic literature. Every single major doctrine about the unseen realm, spiritual beings, the origin of evil, and the structure of the cosmos comes from texts that were removed from most Protestant Bibles. And the reason that they were removed wasn't because they were historically inaccurate. It was because of institutional politics in the 4th century. Now, this connects back to things that we've talked about on the channel before. Remember when we covered the lost books of the Bible, Samuel the seer, Gad the seer, Ahijah's prophecies? Same pattern. Books that were considered scripture got excluded when they became inconvenient to institutional power. Or when we looked at how ancient Israelites worshiped multiple gods with archaeological proof and how they systematically erased God's wife Asherah from the historical record. Same editing process. The Deuteronomistic reforms weren't a one-time thing. They continued through the Second Temple period, right up through the canonization debates. And when we examine the Dead Sea Scrolls and what the Essenes at Qumran were actually preserving, they were holding on to these texts because they understood how foundational they were. They weren't some fringe cult. They were a legitimate Jewish community maintaining the original scriptural traditions. The pattern is always the same. The closer you get to the original sources, the more complex and interesting the story becomes. What gets taught in churches is a simplified, politically convenient version of something that's actually much more layered and sophisticated. These texts, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the library of Second Temple Judaism. These are the texts that Jesus read, that the apostles quoted, the texts that early Christians considered authoritative. The evidence is overwhelming. The New Testament quotes them, Jesus operated within their framework, early church fathers called them scripture, and multiple Christian communities preserved them for centuries. The only reason they're excluded from most modern Bibles is 4th century church politics deciding what fit institutional control narratives. And modern pastors keep teaching the theology while not acknowledging where it actually comes from. Where does it end? Well, this is where we end. As usual, you can verify everything presented here. My sources are in the pinned comment and description, or read the books of Enoch yourself. They're available online. Then check the academic scholarship and look at what early church fathers actually wrote. Don't take my word for it, go to the sources. That's what this channel is for, presenting information that might be controversial, backed by evidence that you can verify yourself. If you found this valuable, subscribe and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see improved. If you disagree, leave a comment explaining why, with sources of course. Finally, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the world isn't always this simple, but it's always this interesting. I'm Alex Arnold. Thanks for riding the brain train, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.